Under Vanishing Skies by G.S. Fields. Chapter 1. Some say fate is fickle. She isn't. She's a twisted, psychotic bitch. It was the only way to explain why nearly everyone on the planet was dead. Everyone including my family. And I was out here fishing. I should have been with them when the storm hit, but I screwed up. Now this endless loop of a meaningless existence was my punishment. Every day was the same. Wake up, drink, eat, drink, fish, drink, and go to sleep. Death should be quick, not drawn like this. I tried to push the familiar dark thoughts from my mind and cast my line out. It landed 50 feet from my kayak. I set the reel and leaned back to wait. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Rick cast his line. It plopped a yard from where mine had just landed. I turned my kayak to face him. "Come on," I said. "The Indian Ocean is a big place." Rick laughed. "Lighten up, Aron. You really need to learn how to let go of all that negative energy." "You sound like that yoga instructor that my wife dragged me to see," I said. "I didn't know you took yoga." "I didn't," I said. "I pulled my goddamn hamstring kneeling down on the mat. That was my first and last yoga class." Rick laughed. "That's too bad. Yoga really helps clear the mind." "That hippie shit doesn't work for me." "How do you know unless you give it a chance?" Holding onto his fishing pole with one hand, he held out his other hand and formed an O with his thumb and middle finger. "Empty your thoughts and look around you," he said. "You're fishing in one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Think of this as your happy place." "This may be your happy place," I said, "but it's not mine. My happy place is back in California. If I was back there, I'd let go of this negative energy in a millisecond." His smile dimmed. "If you were there, you'd be dead." He paddled his kayak over by mine and said, "Come on, buddy. It's been 12 years. You gotta let it go." "Let it go? I'll let it go when I'm laid out on a funeral pyre, and the flames are—" A gust of wind whipped across the ocean and peppered my face with salt water. "God damn it," I said, under my breath. I squeezed my eyes shut against the burn of salt and blinked until I could make out the unmistakable silhouette of Lohifushi. A half-dozen palm trees poked haphazardly up through the jungle canopy like a bad haircut. Lohifushi wasn't the smallest island in the Maldives, but at just over a quarter-mile around, it was far from being the largest. "You okay?" Rick asked. "Yeah. Perfect." I wiped the water from my unshaven face and looked out beyond the island. A line of dark purple clouds bridged the gap between the grayish-blue morning sky in the east and the black, star-filled arcs that scarred the northern and southern horizons. The arcs appeared the day after the storm hit. Each arc was edged with an electric greenish-blue hue that twisted around like the aurora borealis. I leaned forward, rested my arms on the paddle, and watched a steady stream of fire streak across the black zones. The kids who were born after the storm probably didn't think twice about the arcs, but I did. I paid close attention to how much larger they grew each year. They didn't grow by a lot, but they grew enough to reassure me that in a few more years the atmosphere above the islands would be gone. I just wished it would hurry up. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing. Just watching the solar particle show." "I told you a million times those are meteors." "And I told you that meteors burn up in the atmosphere. You know damned well there isn't enough atmosphere in the black zones to burn up anything." He bumped his kayak into the side of mine and said, "Those meteors are burning up in the sky above your thick head." He shook his head. "Solar particles. You're such a moron." and you're a know-it-all asshole. I knew that he was probably right, but I'd never give him the satisfaction of telling him. And besides, he had no way to prove it. Nobody outside the Mars colony knew how bad it was. About a year ago, they'd sent a reconnaissance ship down to search for survivors. They told us that we were all that was left, or at least all that was left worth saving. They didn't say much about the solar storm or the atmosphere. Their silence on the subject told me all I needed to know. We were screwed. Instead, they talked about the rescue mission. I remembered how proud they were when they announced that a cargo ship would arrive in a year to take 1,000 lucky passengers back to the colony. Lucky my ass. They'd been terraforming that planet for 50 years and they still weren't finished. Rick rammed my kayak again, knocking my paddle into the water. I managed to grab it before it floated away. "Asshole," I said, beneath a smile. At 38, Rick still had one foot firmly planted in his childhood. I suppose that was another reason why I liked him. He could make me forget about this hellhole for a while, but I never forgot about it for long. "Come on," he said. "We should head in before Helen sends out a search party." He counted the fish in the empty front passenger compartment of his kayak. "I got over 4 dozen. What about you?" "About the same," I said. "She's not going to be happy." I shrugged and grabbed my paddle. The size of the catch had decreased steadily every year since the storm. In another few years there'd be nothing left to catch. I dug my paddle into the water, turning the boat towards the dock. I could hear Rick sloshing behind me. After all these years, that clumsy son of a bitch still paddled like a drunken tourist. It didn't take long before I slipped into the easy, relaxed rhythm of plunge, pull, lift, rotate, plunge, pull, lift, rotate. Each breath I took was in perfect sync with the stroke of the paddle. Within seconds, my conscious thoughts were replaced by the hypnotic lull of paddling. Forget all that yoga bullshit. This was my happy place. A light in the east caught my eye. I looked over and saw the sun's rays shoot up behind the cloud bank on the horizon. The scene looked like the cover of a Watchtower pamphlet, the kind I used to find wedged in my screen door back home. "Hey, Rick," I said, looking over my shoulder. "Yeah? You think any Jehovah's Witnesses survived the storm?" "What?" "You know, Jehovah's Witnesses, the guys in white shirts and black ties. They always seem to show up around dinner time, trying to save souls." "What about them?" "I'll bet a bottle of Mohammed's moonshine that if any of them had survived, they're still out there somewhere, knocking on doors, pissing people off." I heard him laugh. I kept paddling. 20 minutes later, we reached the dock. William was waiting for us, his bony legs dangling over the edge. Rick coasted in beside me, and I saw the concern in his eyes when he saw his son. I had arrived on the resort on the same day as Rick and Sarah. I came here to do some serious fishing. They had come here on their honeymoon, to do some serious fucking. I guess we both succeeded. 9 months after we arrived, William was born into this dying world, and I was still fishing. Despite my best efforts, the kid ended up calling me Uncle Aron. Don't get me wrong. I liked William. He was smart, a lot smarter than any 10-year-old I'd ever known. But the kid was like a tick. He kept showing up uninvited in unexpected places. "You can't keep doing this," Rick said as he climbed onto the dock. "You've been here all night again, haven't you?" William lowered his head, hiding his bright hazel eyes behind his long blonde bangs. "I told you last night to go back home and get some sleep." "But I wasn't tired." "Don't give me any of that crap. Your mom's probably been up all night worrying about you." Rick glowered at him. "Come on, William, you know how sick she is. What if she needed help in the middle of the night and you weren't there for her?" William looked up and glared back. "Take it easy on the kid," I said. "He's here now, so put him to work." Rick's face softened and he said, "It's just that hanging out on the dock all night by yourself is dangerous, and look at you." He pointed at William's legs. "You're covered in mosquito bites." William shrugged and studied his dirty bare feet. I'll be goddamned if William didn't look just like his old man. They both had that stupid cowlick that stuck straight up and bounced around like a spring. Even the scowls on their faces were identical. I chuckled. Rick looked at me and asked, "What's so funny?" "The two of you. You're like different versions of the same software." Rick smiled and then looked over at William. "All right, you heard your uncle." He pointed to a stack of plastic buckets next to the old bait shack at the foot of the pier. "Go bring a couple of those buckets over so we can unload the fish." William ran over and returned a few seconds later with the buckets. We worked as a team. Rick and I tossed him the fish, and he dropped them in the buckets. His face lit up when he spotted the stingray at the bottom of my kayak. "Wow," he said. "Everyone said they were gone. Everyone except Mr. Tompkins. He said the stingrays and some of the other fish would return once the weather got better. Do you think he's right? Are they coming back?" "I'm sure they are," Rick said, giving me a cautionary glance. He must have sensed that I wanted to tell William that Mr. Tompkins was a dumbass, and like the other dumbasses who thought things would get better, he handed out false hope with a stupid smile. Instead, I tossed William a fish. He caught it, but he paused to study my face before dropping it into the bucket. "What the hell do I know?" I said. "I'm just a dumb computer geek. You should listen to your dad. He's the college professor." When we finished unloading the fish, I picked the stingray up by the tail and said, "Let's get these fish to Helen before she comes out here after us." We walked in single file up the hard-packed sand through the dense jungle foliage. Rick led the way, followed by William. They each carried a bucket of fish. I brought up the rear holding the stingray. I watched William stagger up the trail, bending from side to side as he tried to counterbalance the weight of the bucket. He looked like an omnidirectional antenna, tall, lanky, wobbly. Despite his wiry build, he managed to lug the heavy bucket without stopping. "Doing okay?" I asked. "Uh-huh," he grunted. I smiled. The path soon opened up and the dining hut came into view. 6 thick wooden poles held up the thatched roof like some kind of tiki circus tent. The sides were open, allowing the breeze to pass through. A dozen years ago, this place had fed up to 300 hungry tourists who'd wandered in from the beach to graze on the gourmet buffet. Now there were under 200 people left on the island, and no one ate in the main dining room anymore. People only came here to pick up food from Helen, and take it back to their huts to eat. We worked our way through the empty, large, round tables and headed for the door on the back wall. Light peeked through the cracks, and I could hear the clanging of pots and pans, along with the unmistakable sound of Helen humming some Australian folk melody. Rick pushed the door open, and the familiar sweet smell of fresh-baked plantain bread filled my nostrils. Helen turned from the sink and wiped her hands on her apron. She gave us a warm smile and said, "G'day, boys. What have you got there? No, wait, let me guess. Is it fish?" A smile spread across William's face. Helen had a way with William. Hell, with all the kids. She was their surrogate grandmother, and she took the role seriously. Most of them were born after the storm, and she knew they would never meet their real grandparents. William set his bucket down, ran over to me, and snatched the stingray out of my hand. "Guess what, Helen?" Without giving her time to respond, he held it up. "Look!" She put her hands on top of her overripe breasts, which sat on her barrel-shaped belly. "That will make a marvelous brekkie. It should keep everyone's mind off today's small catch." She glanced at me over her bent, wire-framed glasses. After 12 years on the island, I still couldn't understand all of her Aussie lingo, but I sure as hell understood that look. "Don't blame me," I said, pointing at Rick. "The honorable council member over there wouldn't shut up and kept scaring away all the fish." "You're not pinning this on me," Rick said. "You were the one who was splashing around." Helen shook her head and said, "My old Bob used to say that fishermen were born honest, but somewhere out on the water, they learned to get over it." Helen and her husband had come to the island to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. After Bob died from a heart attack a year after the storm, Helen had busied herself by becoming the island cook. She barked out some orders, and we followed her directions. After setting the buckets down by the sink, Rick and William put on an apron. They each grabbed a knife and started filleting the fish on the stainless steel counter next to Helen. I dropped the stingray on the wooden butcher block that sat in the middle of the kitchen, and I prepared to cut up the prize catch. "So, Rick, why were you out fishing this morning?" she said. "Don't you have to head back to Mali for the council meeting?" "Nope. It's postponed for a week while they find a replacement for Hans Gerritsen," Rick replied. "Oh, my. Another one quit?" she asked. "That's what they told me," Rick said. From the tone of his voice, I knew that he didn't believe it. There was obviously something behind the recent string of council members quitting. Rick had tried to talk about it a couple of times, but I had managed to change the subject. I didn't give a rat's ass about the Council of 13. I mean, what was the point? Even if the ship managed to make it to Earth, pick up the people who were selected by the Council to go to the colony, and then somehow make it back to Mars, their chance of survival was no better than if they stayed here. I didn't care how much the Mars colony had expanded over the last decade, or how much the terraforming had progressed. I knew deep down in my soul that, like all dominant species before us, it was mankind's turn to disappear. That's why I told Rick to scratch my name from the list. I planned to die right here, drinking and fishing. Helen looked over at Rick and said, "Well, I guess you can spend some quality time with your family then." "Unfortunately, I agreed to go out to Makanudu and make some repairs on the communications tower. I have to leave right after breakfast." "What?" William threw his knife on the counter and it hit with a loud metallic clang. "I'm sorry," Rick said. "I was going to tell you after we brought breakfast to Mom." "Why can't Uncle Aron go?" "Because it wouldn't be fair," Rick said. "Your uncle has been doing most of the repair job since I've been on the council." I made the mistake of looking over at William. Tears fell down his freckled face. "I don't care," William cried out. Helen draped her flabby arm around his shoulder, but he shirked it off. "Mom's sick and can't do nothing, and you're always at that stupid council thing. It's not fair." He ran out of the kitchen. Rick took off his apron and said, "I'm sorry, Helen." She nodded, and he took off after William. I looked over at Helen and was momentarily trapped by her gaze, but I managed to break free. I focused my attention on the stingray that I'd butchered. Now she had 2 reasons to be pissed off at me. I felt the guilt rising up within me, but I shoved it back down into its place. Just because I didn't have a family, everyone seemed to think it was okay for me to travel around from island to island and fix the goddamn communications equipment. Well, they were wrong. I'd done my share of work. I deserved some rest and relaxation. Rick was the only one who understood. I'm sure that's why he took the job before it came my way. I put the knife down, closed my eyes, and took a few deep breaths. When I opened them, I found my thumb absently tracing the thick scar across my wrist. If Rick had really wanted to do me a favor, he should have walked away and let me finish what I'd started 12 years ago, on the end of that pier. I skipped breakfast and lunch, partly to avoid a lecture from Helen, but mostly because I didn't want to run into Rick. I knew that if I saw him, I'd probably change my mind and take his place. But he left a couple of hours ago, so I decided to go on a run. Running, like kayaking, helped me shake off funky moods like this. I searched for my shorts, then remembered that they were still in my backpack. I'd taken them along with me on the last repair trip, but never got a chance to run. Kneeling on the floor, I blindly hunted for the bag under my bed. My hand brushed against the threadbare shoulder strap and I yanked it out. I stood up and gave it a good shake before throwing it on the bed to dislodge any insects that had made my bag their home. The musty smell brought back a flood of memories. The pack had been my constant companion after the storm. Rick, Jin, and I had hopped across the islands in search of electronic parts that hadn't been completely fried by the electromagnetic pulse that preceded the solar storm. When we showed up on the island, everyone used to say the same thing. They said we looked like the start of a bad joke. A Harvard professor, a Chinese officer, and a drunken computer geek walked into a bar. Despite the odd composition of our team, we had managed to cobble together a crude VHF radio network, thanks to Rick's electrical engineering background, Jin's military experience with radio systems, and my lackluster programming skills. It took 4 years before we finally set up the first of over 200 relay towers across the islands. Finally, a year ago, we completed the Intra-Island Communications Network, or IICN, as everyone called it. I couldn't understand why people felt compelled to create acronyms with the end of humanity looming in front of them. But they did. I tried to discourage it with my own acronym. I wanted to call it the Communications Unified Network Trunk, but I got overruled. The IICN wasn't much of a network, but it provided everyone who had a data mat with the ability to send and receive text messages. There was also just enough bandwidth to provide a rudimentary voice and video communications channel. However, because of that limitation, the Maldivian Defense Force controlled all video and voice communications. Only MDF personnel and a few others were authorized to use it. Even though the IICN only provided text message service, people went nuts when it was completed. But I didn't help build it to make people happy. I built it to keep my mind off Kelly and the girls. I'd become obsessed with finding out what had happened to my family after the storm. But with no communication to the outside world, I didn't know whether they were dead or alive. I never did find out. But I didn't need to. 6 months after the storm, refugees began to trickle in, and the stories they told crushed any hope I had of my family's survival. The stories painted a picture of hell. The atmosphere somewhere north of Spain and south of Bolivia was gone. This was the area we called the Black Zone. In my opinion, the people who were in the Black Zone when the storm hit had been the lucky ones. They had suffocated to death when the air bled off into space. Not a great way to die, but at least it was quick. Those between the Black Zones and here had it worse. We called that area the Middle Zone. Not very creative, but I guess there were only so many ways to describe hell. The Middle Zone extended from the tip of Mexico up to the northern Black Zone, and from the top of Australia down to the southern Black Zone. There was just enough atmosphere in the Middle Zone to breathe, but not enough to block the X-ray radiation emitted from the sun. Most of the people in that zone either died from radiation burns or from the extreme change in weather caused by a sudden decrease in atmospheric pressure. The refugees who made it to the Maldives described brutal massacres, rapes, and cannibalism as civilization crumbled. I tried my best to avoid listening to their stories. Kelly and the girls had been in that zone. If I let my mind go there, I'd probably go completely insane. I shook my head to knock out the depressing thoughts. Grabbing my bag, I reached inside and found my running shorts wadded together with some T-shirts that had seen better days. I got dressed, walked outside, and took off. Loifushi wasn't a runner's paradise. 1 lap around the island equaled a mile. It was like running around a big parking lot. But as long as I kept moving, I didn't care. Running enabled me to mentally escape from this tropical island prison, and soon I lost myself in the run. As I turned the corner by the old bait shack at the base of the pier for the 10th time, I could feel my mind preparing to make a break for it. Another few laps, and I'd be off this godforsaken rock, if only mentally. I followed the lush green canopy that covered most of the white sand trail that circled the island, connecting the different groups of huts. I loved this part of the trail. The trees provided protection from the sun's strong rays, and the breeze, cooled by the shade, felt good against my sweat-soaked skin. Each hut that I passed looked exactly like the next, with white stucco walls and thatched roofs. At the end of one of those groups, I ran past little Emily. She was still on the front deck of her hut, playing with her dolls. She looked up, smiled at me, and made one of her doll's hands wave at me again. Emily was a sweet girl, but every time I looked at her, it brought back too many memories of my own daughters, Caitlin and Teresa. They used to play with their dolls like that, and would stay out all day long if I had let them. The memory squeezed my heart like a vice, making it hard for me to breathe. I looked the other way, pretending not to see her, but she yelled out, "Hello, Mr. Aron." I forced a smile, waved, and then looked ahead just in time to avoid getting whacked by a massive palm frond that hung low over the path. I ducked under it. When I looked up, the old surf bar came into view. It sat on the northern tip of the island, where some of the world's best left-breaking waves gently rolled along the coastline. It was now void of surfers. Farther on, the path opened up onto a long, weathered boardwalk that hung out over the shallow water in a big, sweeping half-circle. I ran through the gauntlet of huts that lined it on either side, each one suspended over the water by stilts. Once highly desired honeymoon suites, they now served as warehouses and workshops. Up ahead, I saw a small group of people milling around in front of the hut where coral was crushed into the powder we used to filter our drinking water. They were talking amongst themselves and didn't pay any attention to me. I ran through their cloud of thick coconut fiber cigarette smoke. The acrid haze stung my eyes. I reached the end of the boardwalk and continued down the eastern shore. The wind pushed my back as if telling me to pick up the pace. Sweat dripped into my eyes as I sprinted around the corner. I wiped them clear and saw the ruins of the old observation deck. It was just visible through an opening in the foliage. All that remained of the deck now was a broken pile of salt-bleached wood. When I had first arrived on the island, I spent a lot of time on that deck, drinking beer and trading fishing stories with other tourists. Fishing had been one of my greatest pleasures, but now it was just a way to survive, and an excuse to get away from everyone. Those bastards at SATCOM Control Services had known that, and they used it as bait. They knew that I wanted to cancel their contract, so to keep me from making any hasty decisions, they flew me out to India for a couple of meetings, and then had generously offered me a 3-day, all-expense-paid fishing trip to the Maldives. I'd been offered bribes before, but I'd never taken one. But they had offered me a trip to the Maldives. It was number 3 on my list of places to fish before I died. I could have sent for Kelly and the girls to join me, but I didn't. I lied to Kelly. I told her that I had to stay in India for more meetings. Now I lived with that lie. Every day of my life. I stumbled over a tree root, managed to stay on my feet. The jungle closed in around me as I approached the end of the lap. When I reached the entrance of the pier, I saw Mohammed running toward me. He waved his arms, and I slowed down. "Aron! Aron!" Fighting to catch my breath, I stopped a few yards in front of him and put my hands on my hips while looking at my feet. Mohammed was the island doctor, only he wasn't really a doctor. He had been the sports trainer at the resort. The fact that he was a sports trainer had always struck me as funny. He looked like one of those Buddha statues that sat next to the cash register in a second-rate Chinese restaurant. The only difference was that Mohammed was from Bangladesh, not China. And unlike Buddha, Mohammed wore bright flowered shirts, a sarong, and flip-flops. "Hey, Mohammed. What's up?" "The pirates have attacked Makunudu." I looked up. My stomach suddenly twisted like the vines of a banyan tree. Rick was on Makunudu. "When?" I finally managed to say. "I just received a message from one of the survivors. He's requesting medical assistance. Kamish is readying the boat over there," he said, pointing toward the pier. "He will be ready to leave in a few minutes." "What about Rick? Did you hear from him?" "I sent him several text messages, but..." The look on his face made the vines in my stomach twist tighter. These pirates weren't like the ones in the bedtime stories my father had read to me. They were like locusts. They plundered and consumed every resource in their path. Their leader was Jamal, a self-proclaimed prophet. Most of the pirates were from Somalia, but some were from other parts of Africa and the Middle East. The pirates saw themselves as religious soldiers who were finishing what Allah had started. They called it the final jihad against infidels. I called it mass murder. 3 years ago, they had turned their attention on the Maldives. At first, there had only been a few attacks, and they were limited to a couple of long-range supply ships. Recently, They started raiding the outlying islands. I'd gone to some of those islands to help. The image of the carnage they left behind was seared into my brain like the brands they burned onto their victims. Aron, you must have faith that Rick... I ran toward the boat and yelled, "Let's go!"